Good morning. I wanted to spend some time talking to you about an outside source and how to apply that to middle passage as one of the options for your final essay. So what we're doing with the application of these outside sources, there are two options. The one about internalized oppression and also this one about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so one of them is a psychological analysis of a text and the other one is cultural analysis. It's also psychological, but with a specific culture in mind. And so both of these ways of looking at a text lets us have deeper understanding, and it's sort of like a lens with which to analyze the text. So what this presentation will show you is how to apply the one chapter of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroy to how to apply it to middle passage and specifically to Rutherford Calhoun. Dr. Joy DeGroy wrote the text, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, several years ago. She is a professor at Portland State University, and the text focused on sociological and psychological responses to because of or born out of slavery among African Americans. And a lot of her work was done before some of the genetic work that has been done more recently regarding the intergenerational aspects of trauma, and it is aligning with the genetic. So the sociological was done first, and now the genetic is catching up with that. So in her text, she recognizes, like many sociologists and psychologists, that there are behavior patterns that are associated with post-traumatic slave syndrome. We also know that trauma has created, with internalized oppression, behavior patterns. But these three are specific that she found to African Americans: vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. So we're going to spend a little time on each of them. Vacant esteem is a belief about a person's self-worth. And in her interviews, she found that many African Americans, particularly young people she interviewed, felt like they had no worth. Or very little. And this is communicated to them from society, from community, and from their own family. As far as their own family, one of the ways this could be focused on them is communication with misdirected discipline. So African American parents disciplining their children using corporal punishment without a lot of anger, I'm going to punish you so the police don't, things of that nature. It also has been handed down through slavery all the way down into institutions like our schools, which we see a higher incidence of suspensions and disciplinary action against African Americans disproportionately to their white counterparts for the same behavior. Another contributor to vacant esteem is over-incarceration. So this is just an interactive map that you can look up on the pudding, and it is shows that where slavery had been present, that there is similarly an overrepresentation of incarceration of African Americans in those states. Another way vacant esteem is communicated is a continued school segregation. Since segregation became illegal, there have been waves of improvement in our schools' outcomes. Basically, the ultimate sort of research has showed over and over again that when schools are integrated, students, both white and students of color, do better. And in 1991, there was a law that was passed in Oklahoma, went to the state Supreme Court, that said that the schools no longer had to follow desegregation laws, and they could segregate again. And we have seen since 1991 a lowering of outcomes for students of color. A final way is financial discrimination. Over the years, banks and mortgage lenders have repeatedly been found in violation of racist sort of practices with African and Latinx folks. And there was a big case in 2012, and they had to pay out, there was like 30,000 customers. And then there was a recent case in 2018 in Sacramento, again, forcing and charging African American lender, people who are trying to borrow money, charging them more, putting them in high-risk loans, and increasing their chances of foreclosure. The final way is also how the media portrays the worth of Black people. We have cases where roles and stories are told and propagated where they're limited roles. This is changing slowly in the last few years, but a lot of times you see still African Americans as maids, as the criminal, as in this case of Hurricane Katrina, when white folks were taking items from stores and things. It was saying that they found an item to help them, and when Black people were doing the same thing, it said that they were looting. This is also after there was also white vigilantes who killed African Americans after Katrina and were not held responsible for those crimes. So another indicator of vacant esteem, is these students that she interviewed invited suicide, self-degradation, or said things like, oh, I can't believe I lived to see 25, or I can't believe I lived to see 18. They didn't really have an idea that they had a future. And a final indicator is this idea of crabs in a barrel. It is an idea that African Americans will be pitted against each other to fight each other to get out of the restrictions of the barrel, and to fight to get out and to get to the top. And so they'll pull each other down in the process. The second area is ever-present anger. And ever-present anger comes from when someone has a repeated block goal of like discrimination and racism. This can be seen you can see here some instances of employment. There still is unemployment issues where unemployment's always consistently been twice as high for African Americans and for white, even given differences and making corrections for level of education and all of those things. They are repeatedly pulled over by cops at a higher rate, despite the fact that they're more often found without drugs, particularly Latinx, but also Blacks are found without drugs or any paraphernalia, where whites are more often found with it, yet they are less likely to be pulled over. There's also ever-present anger just because of the effects of slavery, knowing that and reminders that they were forcibly chained, displaced, beaten, and killed, kidnapped. Sometimes African Americans have learned the ways of their captors in order to deal with and battle the ideas and the views of slavery. So we see a violence that is perpetrated among African Americans in response to this. There's other theories around this, but another area of ever-present anger. The third area is racist socialization, and so this is when African Americans adopt the slave masters' values and worldviews. And when I say slave masters, I mean white folks in domination, which even though we don't have slave masters now, there are definitely white supremacist views or white dominant views that are predominant. In this one picture, there's a movie in the 1950s called Imitation of Life, which shows this idea of are you able to pass as white, and that is the predominant goal, and it's sort of reinforced. Some symptoms of racist socialization that are present in our days and today: accepting white views of professionalism. Why is it not considered professional for African Americans to wear their hair naturally or in dreads? They should be able to, right? Or the notions of good hair, they shouldn't have to straighten it. Some African Americans focus on skin lightening in order to seem more white. They get accused of acting white when they adopt sort of maybe more professional ways of speaking or of dressing or of acting. They may avoid mental health help. They might say that the talk with their African American children is not needed. The talk is this idea of being able to protect yourself from police and other people. John Henryism, there's a sense to overwork because we've had it harder in the past, so we need to work hard, and that's part of who we are. And so there's a lack of self-care. They might disassociate with Black culture. They might avoid discussions regarding race. They might focus on this bootstrap mentality of, your worth comes from how hard you work and that you should be able to measure up. Your material possessions are your value, and they might discount their own potential just because of race. So you want to include post-traumatic slave syndrome chapter, which is in files, in your essay, or the understanding internalized racism, or both. So you have some options. Please go on to read entry 3 and complete the discussion questions.